I kept rehearsing the sentence in my head until it stopped sounding like language and started sounding like a threat. Not a threat to anyone out there, those unseen shapes beyond the walls, beyond the maps, beyond the smoke. A threat to the room, to the order of, to the thin, brittle peace that existed only because no one disturbed it. The thought came the way a splinter, small at first, almost harmless, easy to ignore if you didn't press on it. But every time I tried to set it down, it caught again. It nagged at the back of my teeth, behind my ribs, in the space between one breath and the next. I could feel it waiting there whenever the talking stopped. I told myself it wasn't my place to say it. That was always the first lie. Clean, familiar, almost comforting. A lie that had saved me more than once. If it wasn't my place, then it couldn't be my fault. If it wasn't my voice, then I didn't own the echo. But the thought wouldn't accept that. It didn't care about places. It didn't care about the invisible lines that separated who could speak from who could only listen. It sat there anyway, stubborn as hunger, and every time I looked at a face near me, calm, focused, tired, certain, I felt the weight of what I knew and what I wasn't saying. There were moments when the room felt too quiet, like the walls were leaning in to hear whether I would finally do it. I would swallow and feel the motion drag slowly down my throat, as if even my body hesitated to help me. I would shift my jaw. I would press my tongue against the back of my teeth and imagine the first word escaping, light and simple, the way words always look before they leave you. Then I would imagine the second part, the turning of heads, the pause that wasn't permission, the sudden attention that felt like a spotlight. I would imagine the expression that would settle on the nearest face. Not anger, not surprise, but that colder disappointment, the unspoken accusation that I had stepped outside my boundary, that I had reached for a power that wasn't mine. My hands always betrayed me first. I would touch my sleeve, pinch the fabric, rub my fingers together as if I could grind the thought into dust. I would focus on small details to keep myself from rising. The faint grit on the tabletop, the soft scrape of a chair leg, the rhythm of someone's pen tapping in patience or irritation. The ordinary sounds of a world pretending it was still ordinary, and through it all, the thought kept taking shape. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a revelation delivered like lightning. It was simply a pattern that didn't align, a detail that refused to fit into the story everyone else was telling. A small wrongness that, if followed to its end, led somewhere no one wanted to look. I tried to frame it differently. I tried to soften it in my mind, to turn it into something safer, an observation, a question, a suggestion. Anything but what it truly was. A warning. Warnings change the temperature of a room. They force people to choose. They make the future feel present. And if the future turns out fine, everyone remembers the warning as an embarrassment. If it turns out badly, everyone remembers it as a challenge that should have been crushed sooner. There was another lie I used after the first one stopped working. Someone else will say it. Someone higher. Someone braver. Someone whose voice won't shake. Whose words won't be mistaken for doubt. Someone whose speaking won't be interpreted as defiance. But I watched the people who could speak. I watched them measure their sentences carefully, the way you measure steps across ice. I watched them perform certainty like it was part of the uniform. I watched them nod at things that made their eyes hard, because hardness was safer than hesitation. I could feel the moment approaching, even without knowing what it would look like. A point of no return doesn't announce itself. It arrives disguised as routine, another exchange, another decision, another small motion that turns into something permanent. My heartbeat started to feel loud. I became aware of how much space my breath took up. I tried to make myself smaller without moving, tried to tuck my conscience behind my ribs like contraband. The thought, though, was already standing. It pressed against the inside of my mouth, ready to become sound. And I did what I had been trained to do, without anyone ever saying the words out loud. I let it stay a thought. I let it die there, quietly, before it could become a warning. The place where we worked was built to discourage questions without ever saying so. The ceilings were high enough to make voices feel smaller. The walls carried the marks of years, scratches, stains, faint outlines where older maps or boards had once hung, reminders that decisions had passed through here before and left their residue behind. Everything about the space suggested continuity. What came before had survived. What came now would be absorbed the same way. There was a rhythm to the days that made silence feel natural, arrival at the same hour, the same exchanges of acknowledgement that stopped short of conversation, the same routine checks, the same paperwork passed hand to hand, the same briefings delivered in voices trained to sound measured and assured even when sleep had been scarce. Repetition dulled urgency. If something was truly dangerous, surely it would disrupt the routine. Surely it would announce itself. Authority existed less as a person than as an atmosphere. It lingered in posture, in tone, in the way everyone seemed to know instinctively when to speak and when to look down. Orders were rarely shouted. They didn't need to be. They arrived calmly, sometimes even politely, wrapped in language that suggested inevitability rather than choice. When something was framed as already decided, questioning it felt not just risky, but pointless. I occupied a narrow space within that structure, close enough to hear more than most, far enough from the center to be invisible when attention turned sharp. I handled details, I relayed information. I listened more than I spoke. My presence was functional, not influential. That was made clear not through cruelty, but through habit. No one had ever told me I was powerless. They didn't need to. The architecture of the place did that for them. People like me learned early that survival depended on understanding boundaries. Not written ones, but lived ones. You could contribute, but only in specific ways. You could observe, but only quietly. You could notice inconsistencies, gaps, risks, but only to the extent that you could convince yourself they weren't worth mentioning. The line between diligence and insubordination was thin, and it moved depending on who was listening. There were stories. Everyone knew them, though they were rarely told directly. Someone who had spoken too freely and found themselves reassigned, sidelined, erased from the room where things happened. Someone whose name was no longer used, whose chair stayed empty for a while before being filled by someone more careful. The lesson wasn't that speaking up would get you. The lesson was subtler. Speaking up would get you forgotten. Fear didn't present itself as panic. It was quieter. It was a constant awareness of consequence, a background calculation running beneath every thought. If I say this, what happens next? Who hears it? How is it remembered? Fear taught patience. It taught restraint. It taught you how to look at a risk and decide whether it was worth attaching your voice to it. The chain of command was clear, even when it wasn't visible. Decisions flowed downward. Responsibility somehow always flowed upward, away from where mistakes actually surfaced. If something went wrong, it would be analyzed later, dissected in rooms like this one, spoken about in the careful language of inevitability and circumstance. But in the moment, when alteration was still possible, the system resisted friction. Meetings reinforced that resistance. They followed a pattern that felt almost ceremonial. Information was presented in fragments, never all at once. Each piece supported the next, creating a structure that felt solid simply because it had been assembled deliberately. Doubt had no obvious entry point. To introduce it, you would have to interrupt the flow, force the room to look backward when everyone else was already facing forward. I watched others navigate this with practiced ease. They asked questions that weren't questions. They offered comments confirmed rather than challenged. Even disagreement, when it appeared, was shaped carefully to preserve alignment. The goal was never to stop momentum, only to adjust it slightly without acknowledging that adjustment was happening at all. Outside the room, the world continued in ways that felt strangely disconnected from what was being decided inside. Meals were eaten, jokes were told in low voices, cigarettes were shared. Familiar complaints about weather, supplies, exhaustion passed between people who might, an hour later, be part of something irreversible. Normalcy wasn't a contradiction to danger, it was its disguise. I learned to read faces more than words. A tightening of the jaw, a pause before agreement, a glance that lingered just long enough to suggest unease before sliding away. These were the only admissions allowed. Shared silently, they created a fragile sense of solidarity, proof that I wasn't alone in noticing what felt wrong. But that same silence also ensured nothing would change. What kept everyone in place wasn't blind obedience. It was something more rational, more corrosive. The belief that the system, flawed as it might be, was still safer in the chaos of interruption. That even a bad decision, if made collectively and confidently, was preferable to uncertainty introduced by doubt. I told myself I understood this. I told myself that caution was a form of responsibility, that restraint prevented panic, that questioning at the wrong moment could do more harm than good. These explanations were readily available, polished by years of. They fit neatly into the space where conscience should have pressed harder. As time passed, the environment itself began to feel like an argument against speaking. The longer the plan took shape, the more real it became, and the harder it was to imagine undoing it with a single sentence. Words felt small compared to the machinery already in motion. What difference could my voice make against that? And yet, every detail I handled, every piece of information that crossed my desk, seemed to point in the same direction. Not toward certainty, but toward risk being quietly. The system wasn't blind, it simply prioritized cohesion over caution, unity over interruption. I felt the pressure of that choice without anyone ever placing it directly on me. No one asked for my opinion, no one invited my warning, and that absence itself became an instruction. Speak only when spoken to. So I listened, I observed, I memorized the shape of the decision as it formed, aware that once it was complete, it would be defended not because it was right, but because it existed. And with each passing hour, the space for my voice narrowed, until silence no longer felt like a choice at all, but like the only position the structure allowed me to occupy. The conflict did not arrive all at once. It accumulated. It settled into me the way fatigue does, quietly, gradually, until it altered how everything felt. At first, I treated the thought as a passing concern, something to note and move past. There was comfort in that. If it was temporary, then it didn't require action. I could acknowledge it privately and still remain aligned outward. I had done this before, many times, with smaller doubts that eventually dissolved on their own. But this one didn't dissolve. It followed me between tasks, clung to the edges of conversations, resurfaced during moments that should have been automatic. I would reach for a document and pause, distracted not by what was written, but by what wasn't. I would listen to instructions and feel an internal hesitation that lagged a half-second behind my nod of agreement. The mind is skilled at bargaining when it senses danger. Mine offered alternatives constantly. Maybe I was misunderstanding something. Maybe the risk I saw was already accounted for, discussed in some higher room I would never enter. Maybe my view was incomplete by nature, limited by proximity rather than authority. These explanations were not unreasonable. They were, in fact, comforting. I tested the thought from different angles, trying to weaken it. I reframed it in softer terms. I removed urgency from it. I stripped it down to bare logic and asked myself whether it truly warranted interruption. Each time, it returned unchanged, calm, persistent, unimpressed by my attempts to dismiss it. There were moments, small, fleeting ones, when I came close. A pause in discussion that stretched a fraction too long. A question asked vaguely enough that it could have invited clarification. A silence that felt like an opening rather than a closure. In those moments, I could feel my body preparing before my mind made any decision. My chest tightened, my breath shifted, the muscles in my neck engaged as if anticipating speech. And then the images arrived. Not images of catastrophe, not outcomes or consequences. Those came later. First came the immediate ones. The room turning toward me, the sudden visibility, the sense of having altered the balance simply by opening my mouth. I imagined the tone I would need to use. Measured, deferential, careful not to sound alarmist, and still failing. I imagined my words being received not as concern, but as doubt, not as responsibility, but as friction. I pictured the moment after speaking more clearly than the act itself, the silence that would follow, the way attention would linger just long enough to mark me, the recalibration that would happen silently around me, as others adjusted their understanding of who I was. Not unreliable, worse, unpredictable. Fear has a way of disguising itself as prudence. It suggests patience, it suggests timing. It whispers that there will be a better moment later, when more information is available, when emotions are calmer, when authority is more receptive. I told myself this repeatedly. Not now, not like this, not without certainty. But certainty was never going to arrive. What I had was probability, pattern, intuition sharpened by proximity. And intuition, I had been taught, was not evidence. It was something to suppress in favor of structure. I reminded myself of this. I reminded myself of my role, my function, my place within the sequence of decisions. At night, the thought changed shape. It became less analytical and more personal. Lying still, I would replay fragments of the day and imagine how few words it would actually take to alter the course of what was unfolding. Not a speech, not a confrontation, just a sentence, a pause, a question that refused to resolve itself neatly. That simplicity frightened me more than the complexity of the situation. If the barrier to speaking was so small, then the reason I wasn't crossing it had to be something deeper than procedure. It had to be something about me. I began to catalog my own hesitations the way I once cataloged data. Fear of reprisal, fear of isolation, fear of being wrong, fear of being right and still ignored. Each one felt valid. Together, they formed a structure as solid as any hierarchy I operate within. I told myself that restraint was not cowardice, that silence could be a form of discipline, that maintaining cohesion was itself a moral act in a system built on order. These thoughts had been passed down, reinforced subtly over time. They fit easily into my mind because they had been designed to. Still, the conflict sharpened. I noticed how often I swallowed before speaking, even when what I said was harmless. How my thoughts began to separate from my voice, existing independently, unshared. How silence stopped feeling neutral and started feeling active, like something I was doing rather than something that simply existed. There were moments when I resented those above me, not for their decisions, but for how effortlessly they spoke, for how they filled space with certainty without acknowledging the weight of what remained unsaid. And there were moments when I resented myself more, for understanding the risk and choosing comfort anyway. The thought no longer felt like a splinter. It felt like a burden I carried deliberately. And with every hour that passed, the effort required to speak grew heavier, as if the silence itself was gaining mass, pressing down on my chest, teaching my body what my mind had not yet fully admitted. I was already practicing the act of not speaking, The warning was still inside me, fully formed, but I was learning how to live with it, unspoken. The moment did not announce itself. It arrived the way most irreversible things do, quietly, wrapped in routine, disguised as another step in a sequence that had already been accepted. There was movement in the room, chairs shifting, papers aligning, bodies settling into positions that suggested conclusion rather than debate. The cadence of voices changed. The tentative phrasing disappeared, replaced by language that carried finality in its rhythm, not urgency, certainty. The kind that doesn't invite interruption because it assumes agreement has already occurred. I felt it before I understood it, a tightening behind my sternum, a pressure in my ears, as if the room had suddenly sealed itself. My attention sharpened in an unhelpful way, catching details I would later remember too clearly. The slight tremor in a hand as it reached for a document, the dry sound of a pen scratching its signature, the brief clearing of a throat before a statement that ended discussion rather than opened it. This was it, not the disaster, not the consequence. Just the point where alteration was still possible, but only barely. The narrow ledge between motion and commitment. The thought surged forward with a clarity that startled me. It was no longer abstract. It was no longer a pattern or a probability. It was a simple recognition. If I speak now, the room changes. If I don't, it never will. My body reacted before my reasoning caught up. My shoulders shifted as if preparing to rise. My lips parted slightly, just enough to feel the air against my teeth. For a fraction of a second, I existed in that space where intention becomes action. And in that fraction, everything I feared lined up neatly in front of me. Not punishment, not shouting, something quieter and far more effective. I imagined the interruption landing wrong, too hesitant, too careful, too late. I imagined the glance exchanged between those with authority, the almost imperceptible nod that signaled dismissal. I imagined the room absorbing my words and continuing anyway, unchanged, while I remained exposed. Worse than being wrong was the possibility of being irrelevant. I felt the weight of the structure press down on me in that instant, not as force, but as expectation. The expectation that people like me observed and complied, that we supported decisions after they were made, not before. That responsibility belonged upward, and consequences would be discussed later, if at all. The silence around me was not empty, it was full, dense with consent, heavy with momentum. To speak would not simply add sound, it would fracture that density. It would demand attention. It would require others to choose whether to acknowledge me. My heart began to pound, slow and deliberate, each beat echoing in my ears. I became acutely aware of how visible speech would be, how irreversible. Once words existed, they could not be taken back. They would live in memory, altered by repetition, reshaped by interpretation. I thought of how easy it would be to justify staying quiet, how natural. I told myself that the decision had already solidified before this moment, that my contribution would be symbolic at best, that responsibility for outcomes did not rest with those who had no authority to alter them. These thoughts did not feel like lies in that. They felt like survival. The order was spoken aloud, not loudly, calmly, as if it were merely confirming something everyone already knew. Heads nodded, pens moved, the machinery advanced another step. I felt the exact second when my opportunity closed. It was physical, a release followed by a hollowing, like missing a step you didn't know you were about to take. My jaw tightened, my tongue pressed against the roof of my mouth, holding back a sentence that now had nowhere to go. No one looked at me. That, more than anything, sealed it. The absence of attention. The room did not require my silence to continue. It assumed it. I sat still, my posture unchanged, my expression carefully neutral. From the outside, nothing marked the moment. No visible struggle, no sign of resistance. Just another presence in a room full of compliant bodies. Inside, something settled into place. The thought did not vanish. It did not even weaken. It simply stopped pushing forward, as if it understood that it had reached the limit of where it could go. The order moved beyond discussion and into action. Conversations shifted to logistics, to timing, to execution. The tone lightened slightly, not with relief, but with focus. The future was no longer theoretical. It was scheduled. I listened. I nodded when appropriate. I performed the role expected of me with precision, but I was no longer undecided. Silence had won, not because it was chosen carefully, but because it had been allowed to remain. And in that allowance, the warning became something else entirely, not a possibility, a certainty that would now have to unfold without my voice ever having touched it. The consequences did not arrive all at once. They seeped in. At first, nothing seemed different. The world continued on its tracks with the same mechanical confidence it always had. Messages were sent. Reports were filed. People moved with purpose, as if purpose itself could substitute for foresight. If I hadn't been carrying that thought inside me, I might have believed the decision had been sound simply because it was being carried out so efficiently, but small confirmations began to appear. Quiet ones, The kind that didn't raise alarms but altered tone. Information returned altered, stripped of optimism it had previously carried. Numbers shifted slightly, then again. Language became more cautious without admitting why. Words like delay, adjustment, surfaced, spoken calmly, as if they were minor inconveniences rather than early fractures. I recognized these signs immediately, not because I was prescient, but because they matched the shape of what I had feared. The pattern was familiar now. Each update felt like a response to a question I had never asked out loud. People reacted the way institutions always when reality begins to resist them. They narrowed focus. They simplified explanations. They emphasized resolve. The more unstable things became, the more certain everyone sounded. Confidence thickened in the air, heavy, performative, as if repeating it often enough might solidify what was already slipping. I kept waiting for someone else to say it. Not my exact thought, but something close enough. A recognition, a pause, a recalibration. I listened carefully during briefing, during side conversations, during moments when voices dropped and formality loosened. I watched faces for signs of acknowledgement. What I saw instead was adaptation. People adjusted their expectations downward without naming the cause. They redefined success quietly. What would once have been considered failure became framed as endurance, resilience, acceptable loss. The language shifted subtly, just enough to absorb what was happening without confronting it. That was when the weight truly settled in. Not when the situation worsened, but when I realized how easily it was being absorbed, how the system had room for this kind of damage, how silence didn't just allow consequences, it helped integrate. I began to recognize the future arriving in pieces, not dramatically, not violently, just incrementally. Each piece confirmed that the risk I had seen was not theoretical, it was operational, unfolding exactly along the lines I had traced privately, and then buried. I felt a constant, low-grade tension in my body, not panic, not grief, something more restrained and more corrosive, a vigilance without outlet. I listened more closely than ever, searching for the moment when it would all tip, when the accumulated weight would finally demand acknowledgement. It never did. Instead, the situation became normalized, the extraordinary reduced to routine. What had once felt unthinkable was now managed, scheduled, accounted for in charts and summaries. The absence of catastrophe was treated as validation, even as the cost continued to rise quietly. I realized then that silence does not end when the moment to speak passes. It extends itself forward. It reshapes how you interpret everything that follows. Each confirmation struck me as both revelation and accusation. Not because anyone blamed me, no one could, but because I could no longer pretend I hadn't known. The distance between what I had thought and what I was now seeing collapsed completely. There were nights when the smallest details returned to me with disproportionate force. A phrase used during the decision, a gesture, the exact angle of a page as it was turned. I would replay them not to change the outcome, but to locate the precise instant where divergence had been possible. That was the cruelty of it. The consequences were never sudden enough to justify intervention after the fact, and never subtle enough to be dismissed entirely. They existed in a space that demanded endurance rather than action, a space where acknowledgement felt useless, and confession felt indulgent. Others around me adapted more easily, or appeared to. They spoke about the situation with practiced neutrality, as if describing weather patterns rather than human outcome. They learned how to carry it without letting it show. I learned something different. I learned that foresight offers no protection once it is withheld, that recognizing a danger does not lessen its impact if recognition is kept private. If anything, it sharpens. Every new development felt like a sentence continuing itself long after it should have ended, and with each continuation, the cost of that original silence became harder to measure, because it was no longer tied to a single outcome. It was everywhere, in the adjustments that no longer surprised anyone, in the lowered expectations no one admitted to, in the quiet understanding that something had gone wrong, without ever agreeing on when or why. I remained where I was. I did my work. I followed instructions. From the outside, I had survived the decision unmarked. From the inside, I was living inside its confirmation. And the most unsettling realization was not that speaking up might have changed things. It was that staying silent had ensured I would witness the consequences with complete clarity, and absolutely no right to object to them. Time did not soften it. It organized. The memory never returned all at once. It arrived in fragments, triggered by things that had nothing to do with the event itself. A certain pause in conversation, a familiar tone of certainty spoken too easily, the way a room could still itself when a decision settled, even years later. Each fragment carried the same weight, unchanged. I learned that silence has an afterlife, long after the consequences had been absorbed into reports and explanation, long after the situation had been reframed and filed away as something unfortunate but inevitable. The moment remained intact inside me, preserved. not distorted by time, not dulled by repetition. If anything, it grew sharper as everything else faded. I remembered the physical sensation most clearly, the exact pressure in my chest, the way my jaw had locked, not in defiance, but in restraint, the deliberate stillness of my body as I chose not to move, not to draw attention, not to disrupt the flow of what was already decided. That stillness had felt controlled then, disciplined. Now it felt permanent. I replayed the thought endlessly, not to change it, but to understand why it had never escaped. I examined my reasoning with the same care I once applied to data. I traced every justification back to its source: fear, self-preservation, deference disguised as respect, responsibility deferred upward until it dissolved completely. None of it absolved me. None of it condemned me either. That was the worst part. There was no verdict, no moment of reckoning that allowed me to place the weight somewhere else. The guilt did not demand punishment. It demanded acknowledgement, and acknowledgement offered no relief. I would hear people speak of the outcome in abstract terms, reducing it to lessons learned, adjustments made, improvements planned. Their words floated past me, clean and detached. I never interrupted them. I never corrected the narrative. Doing so would have required explaining my silence, and I had no language for that. The warning I never gave had not disappeared. It had simply changed form. It lived now as memory, as recognition, as a quiet measure against which all future decisions were compared. Every time someone spoke with confidence, I listened for what might be missing. Every time consensus formed too easily, I felt the old pressure return, familiar and unwelcome. I told myself sometimes that silence had been the only option available, that the structure would not have bent, that my voice would have vanished into the machinery without effect. These thoughts arrived less frequently. They no longer comforted me. They sounded thin, rehearsed, like explanations given to satisfy others rather than truth discovered for oneself. What remained was simpler. I had known something, and I had chosen not to let it exist outside my own mind. That knowledge did not make me responsible for everything that followed, but it bound me to it, permanently, quietly. There are moments, even now, when I imagine the sentence fully formed, not improved, not perfected, just spoken. I imagine it entering the room, altering the air slightly, forcing a pause. I never imagine what happens after. The image stops there, because that is where reality diverged. The thought never became a warning. It became a companion. It sits with me in every room where decisions are made. It listens when others speak. It reminds me, without accusation, of the exact cost of remaining unseen. And it does not ask forgiveness. It only remains.